Hello and welcome back. The topic for today's video is going to be the topic of evolution. All right. I know this topic can be a little controversial for some people. I would like you to try and keep an open mind. We're going to talk about evolution in the context of really what we're talking about with evolution at a very basic level is going to be descent with modification. And what I mean by that is there are genes that are passed on from generation to generation. As those genes are passed on, they're modified, okay? And in terms of passing on those genes, okay, where we're really going to kind of tie this together a little bit is when we get to the unit and we talk about DNA, because DNA and evolution kind of tie all of biology together, at least in my mind, okay? DNA, that's going to be our deoxyribonucleic acid. Okay, and that deoxyribonucleic acid is made up of components, okay? Those components are adenosine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine. And we'll talk more in detail about these later. For now, what I want you to remember is that it's made up of A, C, T, and G. Okay, so we use letter abbreviations to refer to the different nucleotides that make up DNA. And don't worry if you don't know what a nucleotide is right now. We're going to talk about that later, okay? But A, C, T, and G make up DNA, all right? And in terms of organisms, any living organism has these same 4 chemical molecules that make up their DNA, okay? That's what kind of unifies everything on the planet, okay? Every organism contains DNA and is made up with DNA. Whether we're talking about the bacteria like Clostridium botulinum or Clostridium tetani, which live in the soil. Okay, those are 2 that you may have heard of before because tetani causes tetanus. That's why you need to get a tetanus shot. Botulinum is where the botulinum toxin comes from, if you've ever heard of Botox. Okay, essentially you're taking a toxin from a prokaryotic cell causing muscle paralysis. Those are examples of prokaryotic cells. They have DNA. You as a human being are made up of DNA. The tomato that you had on your salad is made up of DNA. The rest of the vegetables within your salad is made up of DNA, okay? Any living organism is going to have DNA that makes up its component, okay? That DNA is really kind of our blueprint for life. And in terms of that blueprint, one of the things that we'll talk about later in the semester, okay, is that blueprint has the ability to undergo mutation, okay? Again, don't worry if you don't know what mutation means right now. What a mutation is it's a change in the DNA. And this is a very generic definition. We're going to get into a little more detail later in the semester, okay? But a mutation is a change in DNA. That change in DNA is the modification that I'm talking about with evolution, okay? So you have mutations that accumulate that result in changes to the DNA that can change proteins, that can change function, that over extended long periods of time can give rise to new organisms, potentially. okay? So in terms of evolution, okay, we're going to have macroevolution and there's also microevolution. All right? Both of these are going to be changes in the DNA of a particular organism over time. Macroevolution kind of represents the larger jumps, okay, in changes. Microevolution are going to be the smaller changes that we can observe more directly, okay? And in terms of evolution, the scientist who is credited with coming up with the concept of evolution is going to be Charles Darwin. And in terms of Charles Darwin, okay, he took a lot of heat for this even when it came out back in the 1800s, okay? And the reason Charles Darwin took so much heat is because people kind of misunderstood what he was saying, okay? There are people out there who will tell you that, well, what Charles Darwin stands for is Charles Darwin is saying that man came from ape, okay? And in terms of that, that's not what Charles Darwin was trying to get across as his point. He wasn't saying that man came from monkey. What he was saying was at some point in history, monkeys and man had a common ancestor. Mutations happened which caused one arm to give rise to monkeys. Different mutations arose to give rise to man, okay? So it's not that man came from monkey, he's saying that man came from a common ancestor, okay? And in terms of that, when you look at evolution, that's really what evolution is talking about common ancestors, all right? And in terms of those larger jumps, okay, the jump with the common ancestor diverging into monkey and into man, that would be an example of macroevolution. So that's one of the bigger jumps that I'm talking about. Some of the smaller jumps, I've got an example in the PowerPoints, okay? That microevolution, really the mechanism by which both macro and microevolution are happening is going to be the process of natural selection. Okay? And in terms of natural selection, okay, how this differs from evolution, okay? Evolution's talking about descent with modification. Natural selection is the mechanism by which evolution can happen, all right? So in terms of natural selection, all right, we're talking about a species adapting to a change in the environment, okay? And the example I have in the PowerPoints are going to be beetles, okay? Now within the population of beetles that you might find up in the forest if you go up into northern New Mexico, you're going to have some beetles that are going to have darker shells, some that are going to have lighter shells, some that may have colors in between, okay? They're all part of the same species of beetle, all right? But they've got some variations that go on. And that's something that's important to natural selection, is you have to have naturally occurring variants that occur in the population. And if you want to look at the human species, we have naturally occurring variants in our population as well, all right? One really easy one to look at, or really two really easy ones to look at, hair color, skin color, okay? There's a big diversity of colors out there as far as skin and hair color, all right? We're not talking about the unnatural hair colors that you might go to the salon for, okay? We're talking about the natural hair color you were born with. All right, you've got redheads, you've got brunettes, you've got people who have black hair, you have people who have blonde hair. Same thing with skin color. You have people who have very, very dark skin, people who have very, very light skin. As it stands now, there's not an evolutionary advantage to having one color versus another, okay? In nature, that can change, all right? And at some point, we may favor in our environment dark skin. And what's going to happen is that's going to favor the portion of the population that has darker skin for survival, for reproduction, okay? Going back to our beetles, which is a little less charged as far as color variants go, okay? If we have our light and dark beetles and they're existing there in the forest, there might not be an advantage to being light versus dark until somebody forgets to put out their campfire, sets off a forest fire, and now the forest floor has a very dark color to it. Now there's an advantage for that dark colored beetle because it's going to blend in with the environment. So when those birds come along who feed on the beetles, they're going to pick out the light ones because they can see them against the dark background. If that light colored beetle gets eaten, it doesn't survive to reproduce, to have offspring, okay? That's really what natural selection is about. You're talking about a species, and you're talking about the species as a whole. The thing about natural selection, you're not talking about individuals here. You're talking about populations, okay? So the population of beetles changes over time because the darker beetle is selected. And those genes that are responsible for that darker colored shell offer the advantage, okay? So in terms of that, with natural selection, that's an example kind of how natural selection might work, all right? It's not the only example out there of natural selection. I think your book also has examples of pesticide resistance in insects. Antibiotic resistance with bacteria would be an example of natural selection. Those bacteria who can live in the presence of an antibiotic are going to have an advantage over those bacteria that can't survive, okay? And that advantage that we're talking about is reproduction, having offspring, and passing those genes to the next generation, okay? So really that's what we're talking about with natural selection and evolution, okay? In terms of natural selection and evolution, you have to have a common ancestor, all right, that the differences result from, okay? So you've got some common descent there. You've got, with natural selection, variation in the population, whether that be color or some other trait. I use color just because it's something easy for you to identify with, and it's easy to see. Okay? But that particular trait, that color, has to be able to be inherited to the offspring. Okay? So for example, if in the future people with red hair have an advantage, all right, you can't go to the salon, dye your hair red, and expect to survive, because you dyeing your hair doesn't pass that trait on to your offspring. So your offspring won't have red hair, hypothetically, all right? So in terms of that, you've got to have variation. That variation has to be able to be inherited through the DNA that's passed on to the offspring, okay? And in terms of that, that variation has to give an advantage to one group over the other. And that advantage is allowing that group that has that particular trait to reproduce, okay? And in terms of that, natural selection is not a random process, okay? It's something very concrete, all right? I hope that makes sense. If you have questions about this topic, please let me know. I'm happy to answer questions, okay? The other bit that I will also touch on just really briefly here, there is also what's known as artificial selection, okay? And The difference between natural selection and artificial selection is really the involvement of humans, okay? Best example I can give you for artificial selection are going to be dogs, all right? I love dogs. I've got 2 at home. And in terms of that, with dogs, you may be aware that there are lots of different breeds of dogs, okay? Notice I said breeds of dog, not species of dogs. Dogs are one species. So hypothetically, you could take a Chihuahua and you could take a Great Dane and you could mate them, although that might be challenging, okay, for reasons of differences in size. But they are able to reproduce, okay, and have offspring, all right? Artificial selection involves people saying, you know what, I like the floppy ears, so I'm going to select for that particular trait, okay? It's not based on the environment, okay, or giving the dog an advantage that way, okay? So really, natural selection, we're talking about things that happen within the environment. Artificial selection, we're talking about there's human intervention and choice in which population gets to breed, okay? So for example with that, if you like the floppy-eared dogs, you're going to select the floppy-eared dog to breed to another floppy-eared dog to make sure you get floppy ears, okay? Just for the record, okay, my 2 dogs have pointy ears, all right? And it really doesn't matter to me that they have pointy ears or floppy ears. I'm just using that as an example, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you for your attention.